trafficking or forced labor. Stephen Levin breaks up modern slavery into 6 sectors in his 2009 article, Modern Slavery in America. Prostitution and sex services is 46%. Domestic services is 27%. Agriculture is 10%. Sweatshops and factories make up 5%. Restaurant and hotel workers are 4%, with the remainder coming from the sexual exploitation of children, entertainment, and mail-order brides. So right here, this just says, what is modern slavery? It's a term that we kind of hear a lot, like as a university, because people tend to come in and talk about things like that. But it actually covers a broad range of things. Sex trafficking, like we talked about today, child soldiers, forced child labor, child sex trafficking, involuntary domestic servitude. So it can be labor trafficking or sexual exploitation. Modern slavery persists for lack of regulation, work condition monitoring, and growing demand for cheap labor that allows unscrupulous employers and criminal networks to exploit powerless workers for profit. The sexual exploitation of children, an article by Richard Estes, says that the exact number of children that are sexually exploited in the United States today aren't really known because a lot of things don't get reported. But it's estimated that over 100 million are exploited worldwide. And this is just a quote that says, "Slavery is what slavery's always been, about one person controlling another person using violence and then exploiting them economically, paying them nothing. That's what slavery is about." It's a Kevin Bell's quote from worldpeace.com. So that's basically what slavery is in a nutshell. So how does this information affect us? Human trafficking only happens in other countries, right? It doesn't affect Americans. The vast majority of Americans tend to think that trafficking is a terrible thing, but one that happens in other countries. However, humantrafficking.org states that 14,500 to 17,500 people are trafficked into the U.S. annually. This says the U.S. is actually a transit destination country for trafficking victims, meaning that there are networks and rings in other areas, in other countries, but the U.S. is generally a destination country for people to be trafficked into. The U.S. is like a destination, like I said. Imagine that you're a 12-year-old girl who's been kicked out of her house, nobody to run to, no money, no food. A man offers you money to survive by sex. Like, what do? A lot of people are forced into trafficking because they have no other option. And that was in an article by Laura Cluett. It's called "Sexual Exploitation of Children." So these people are being trafficked to the United States because they have no other option. They're forced into something like that. The economy has a lot to do with it. So what's America doing about this if it's the destination country? The TVPA. The TVPA is the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It was founded in 2000 to combat the problem. According to state.gov.documents.com, the TVPA prescribes appropriate punishment, gives priority to the prosecution of trafficking offenses, and the protection of victims. The T visa is stemmed from the TVPA. The T visa is created through the TVPA. According to the Burma law firm at avlawoffice.com, it's a visa that's issued to people who are victims of severe trafficking, which includes the use of force, fraud, or coercion for sex trafficking and or involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, or slavery. It makes the benefits and services available to victims of severe forms of trafficking. The language of the visa is unprecise. According to the Immigration Law and Policy, obtains permanent resident status. It's put out by the National Immigration Law Center. So the TVPA is something good that the United States is trying to do, but, which leads me to my points, there's a problem with the TVPA and the T visa. Okay. Victims have to prove that they've been severely trafficked. And this is a problem for a lot of people because this leaves a lot of people out. And then if they can't prove that they've been severely trafficked, like right now, like severely trafficked would be like the completely blameless person, and the girl that I mentioned earlier who was forced into sex slavery because she had no other option. People who voluntarily come into sex slavery, whether they really know what they're getting into or not, they're not protected under this T visa. And you have to prove that you've been severely trafficked, so it leaves a lot of people out from getting a visa. Only 5,000 T visas are given out each year. And if you look and see the 17,500 people that are actually trafficked into the United States, you can see, like, do the difference in that. And a lot of people aren't getting the help that they need. Victims are forced to cooperate with law enforcement. That's a problem for a lot of people because it's been talked about that cooperating with law enforcement actually causes a lot of psychological damage. So right now the language of the T visa says, unless you help us, we're not interested in helping you. And a lot of people aren't willing to do this. So instead of coming and trying to apply for this visa, they're scared about what might happen if they testify in court. So they just don't do it. So they're just here, and if the United States finds them, the T visa keeps them from being taken out of the country. So right now, if, like, okay, say a trafficking ring is broken up and you're found, you're just sent back to the country that you came from. There's a problem with that. You get re-trafficked. If you came from this country, it's just a continuing cycle. And because there's only 5,000 given out a year, even these people who meet these other requirements, they can't get them. And the T visa right now, there are a lot of fees and stipulations, like there are with a lot of visas today. People who are trafficked because they don't have money a lot of times. So they don't have access to any of these visas. So while this is a good idea, it doesn't really do much. How can we fix the TVPA? We have to make the visa less expensive, waive some fees, because people can't afford them. That's a problem. We have to remove the severe standard, because if you can't prove you've been severely trafficked, you don't have access to a visa. So we have to remove that and give it to all people who've been trafficked, whether they can prove it or not. We remove the law enforcement requirement, not necessarily saying that they can't, but saying that it's not a requirement to get the visa. And we have to remove the caps and make it more readily available. And I'd just like to conclude with a quote that says, "Human beings are not property. On the International Day for the Abolition of Slavery, let us reaffirm the inherent dignity of all men, women, and children, and let